development. So I think we can begin now. Hello everyone. Thank you all very much for being here today. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly honored to welcome you to our event, Resilient Ethiopia, Sustainable Growth in a Changing Climate, which is jointly hosted with Ministry of Planning and Development. I will be your host for this conference, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Seneshaw Tamru. I'm Senior Country Economist at International Growth Center. For those of you who may not be familiar what IGC is, International Growth Center is a University of Oxford and London School of Economics program that operates in more than 10 countries, supporting policymakers with frontier research. We have been operational in Ethiopia since 2010, collaborating with a number of line ministries, such as Ministry of Planning and Development, Ministry of Labor and Skills, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Industry, and what have you. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all. IGC's mission is to generate and apply evidence-based policy advice that fosters sustainable growth and poverty reduction. Operating through an international network, the IGC conducts rigorous research and facilitates policy dialogues. The white paper, which will be presented by Professor Stefano Caria of Warwick University, and which will be chaired the State Minister of Ministry of Planning and Development. We also have our discussant, Dr. Alemayehu.
Good morning, everyone. I think I'm not going to take too much time because we are going to have a very long day discussing a wide range of, issues in terms of how a government or a country could achieve, sustainable growth at the same time, tackling a climate change issues. I think these issues is, really important for economies like Ethiopia, where the country is facing huge climate change challenges, be it in terms of droughts that we have seen, over the last 2 years, and also sometimes, due to variability of rainfalls, sometimes Ethiopia had faced problems such as floods that had affected huge, development infrastructures and also slowed the productive capacity of, some of the sectors in the economy. So I'm really happy to join this morning. This issue is really important to the government of Ethiopia, more specifically to the Ministry of Planning and Development, as a ministry which coordinates a national climate change issues all across, diverse sectors of the economy. So first of all, I would like to really thank IGC. IGC has been a good partner in terms of, mobilizing research and knowledge across different, subjects, partnering with different government institutes, mainly actually with our institute, which is a policy study institute, and also other sectors of the economy. Such endeavor is really important, as Seneshaw mentioned earlier. Policy making is not, a very mysterious issue. It's a very simple, business context in which, in order to design, an effective policies, a very basics is, to get accurate facts, statistics, and evidences that help us to, substantiate the policy problems that we define, and also help us to identify the strategies, effective strategies that would allow us to, successfully achieve the desired, policy outcomes. So these are a very basic exercises. But of course, there are so many, structural issues, especially in a developing economy context like ours, where research industries, research infrastructures are very limited, and the gap between policy making and evidence, based research exercises are wide. So I really appreciate, the continued support and coordination from the IGC to bridge that gap in terms of identifying, a pertinent, relevant, policy issues, and support a government research institute as well as, a policy making endeavor. So as I said earlier, I think such platforms should always be, supported, and we have always, supported the IGC and did a bit of coordination, in order to frame the research problems and also facilitate such mobilizations of knowledges where we can, discuss with the wider, stakeholders the policy findings they have, and the recommendations in there. I think I should stop there, and we are going to have a long day. There is also a session in the afternoon where we are going to, gather together, discuss, from a policy perspective, what these findings across each, papers that we discussed today could mean. How could, government sectors, especially those institutes which are more relevant to the issues that we discussed today, be it the energy sector, the job creation, urbanization, and also rural development, speaking to, sustainable agricultural growth. And we discuss on those issues, and I will reflect more on those, platform later. For now, I think I will stop there, and also given the responsibility of chairing the white paper presentation, so I should remain here and welcome the professor, and also both Professor Stefano and Professor Alemayehu to come to the stage. I think that is how we should do, right? Or we invite Professor Seyoum later after the presentation. No, I saw him arriving. So I think we should be on the stage and give a few minutes for you to introduce, and we go to the presentation, then the discussion should follow from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for the great opening remark. Stefano will have 30 minutes for presentation. Then Dr. Alemayehu Seyoum will have 5 to 10 minutes for critically reviewing the presentation. Then we will open for Q&A.
Okay. Oh, for the slides. Yes, it's fantastic. All right. I guess you can hear me well. Okay, fantastic. So my name is Stefano Caria. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Warwick, and it's fantastic to be here. So thank you so much for, first of all, our distinguished the chair, Alemayehu, and in particular, Dr. Nemera, who kindly decided to spend the day with us to go through some of these big policy issues that face Ethiopia, and also a big thank you to the audience, both here in Addis and also virtually. The event is hybrid. What I'm going to do today, and I have half an hour, so please kick me out when the half an hour is over. I hope somebody can give me some strong signals of this, is to do 3 things. Number one, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a recent turn in thinking at the IGC, which is focused on sustainable growth. So the IGC, as you just heard in the 2 introductory remarks, is a hub that promotes research in different countries around the world, low-income countries in particular, and we've had an established presence in Ethiopia for probably 15 years now. And we've been promoting research across a number of fields. And a recent turn in our thinking is that we should really be doing more in the sustainability space. So I'll tell you a little bit more about our thinking on sustainability. That's one. Then number two, I'll provide some evidence on where Ethiopia is at and where Ethiopia is going in terms of, in particular, the challenges coming from a changing climate. We often hear a lot about the social and economic challenges of Ethiopia, and so I don't want to take away from those at all. In fact, those are there in the background, but sometimes we hear less about the existing forecast about where Ethiopia's climate is going, and so I'll focus the second part of the presentation on that. So future climate change forecast for Ethiopia. And third, really taking us to the core topic of today, the core agenda for today's workshop, I'm going to start sketching a few areas where we see promising opportunities for further research. That list that I'm going to present you is meant for inspiration rather than being an exhaustive list that really covers everything that there is there to be researched. And so I will leave certain things that are important out, but hopefully it can help us spark a discussion over the coming session, highlighting a few areas where we think research would be particularly important, particularly high return, but areas that are at the same time fairly under-researched so far. Okay, so let's see if the slide goes ahead. Okay, fantastic. So first part of the presentation, IGC Sustainable Development Approach. Okay. This approach, I should start by saying, is summarized in a recent white paper that we published over the summer and in a new revised IGC research strategy. I think in our documents that we've handed out today, there is a QR code that you can scan to get a link to the white paper, but also these documents are available on the website. So please feel free to read them, peruse them, criticize them if need be. But these have been the work, the result of several months of work in the different thematic areas of the IGC, kind of synthesizing where we got to in these last 15 years of research and where we want to go next. The key idea in the white paper is that developing countries are in a sort of puzzling situation, in a bit of a conundrum, especially low-income countries, low and middle-income countries, but we have a focus on low-income countries. Well, the first point is that these countries are low income, so these are the countries that need economic growth the most. There are large numbers of people who are in poverty in these countries. Even the people who are not in poverty, wages are often stagnant, they're often not sufficient for a decent life. So these countries desperately need economic growth to raise the living standards of the population, to increase human welfare. At the same time, this has been known for a long time. In fact, the center is called International Growth Center. Growth is at the center stage of our thinking because of this clear need to generate growth in income to raise living standards. But what was perhaps less appreciated at the start of this process is the fact that this growth very often comes with a set of negative environmental externalities that undermine those very human welfare gains, those very living standard gains that you worked so hard to produce the growth to generate in the first place. So, and here we have in mind both global externalities. The most salient one at the moment is climate change. There are other forms of global externalities, such as the biodiversity crisis. But there are also lots of externalities that are local. Pollution, for example, air pollution being one of them. It's a major killer around the world and something that really detracts from the health and the enjoyment of life of our population. So on the one hand, you need growth desperately. At the same time, generating that growth generates these externalities that undermine the case for growth in the first place. So, and to make things even worse, although historically the contribution of low and middle income countries to some of these global externalities like climate change has been minimal, almost negligible, going forward is not going to be, because these are high growth economies with big populations. So if we don't do mitigation of these externalities in these growing economies, the whole world will suffer. So this is a big conundrum, a big puzzle. And in the past, that's kind of our way of synthesizing a large literature, this conundrum seemed pretty much impossible to solve. If you wanted to protect the environment, you had to do things that curb growth And that meant that you had to be in a position that was politically untenable, because your population was not going to accept saving the environment for the benefit of people in the distant future or elsewhere in the planet at the cost of the living standards that they currently needed to so badly. But the big news is that there has been a wave of technological of innovations in multiple domains that have made that trade-off less blunt, and in some cases that have eliminated the trade-off altogether. Here, by innovation, we mean innovation very broadly. So we certainly are thinking of technological innovation. One very salient example, for example, has been the spectacular takeoff of solar photovoltaic energy, electricity. This was a technology, if you look at documentaries or research on this in the past, that seemed interesting on paper, but definitely not scalable because of cost. So it was just, you can see in that our world in data graph there, around 2009, generating solar energy was one of the most expensive ways of generating energy that you could possibly go for. So yes, you could get clean energy in 2009, but that would come at the cost of just decreasing the competitiveness of your economy, of holding the reins back to economic growth. There would be cheaper and more effective ways just from an economic short-term point of view of generating energy. And so the trade-off was very blunt. But you see, if you just move fast 10 years, the cost, the per unit cost of generating solar energy dropped dramatically. So there has been an incredible technological development in this sector that brought the unit cost to basically the bottom of the distribution of unit cost. So now actually generating solar energy has become the cheapest way of generating energy that you can possibly have. Now, this is simplifying a lot of complications. This is a statistic that describes the cost of generating energy if you're starting afresh. Of course, there are lots of sunk investments in coal or in other technologies that mean that it's still cheaper to use run down existing plants than start new ones. There are also issues related to the grid that hopefully we're going to talk about later, and so on and so forth. So it's not a free lunch quite yet, but at least in principle, the technology out there actually now makes it possible to generate green, pretty much CO2-free energy at the lowest economic cost. So this is a spectacular development that makes changes completely our view of the compatibility between promoting growth and protecting the environment. But technology alone won't solve all the trade-offs. And so we need development at least on two additional domains. First of all, the social protection domain. Some people are simply, technological developments are going to take too long for them to benefit, for them to be protected by this development and the growth that comes with them. And so we need to think of social protection today. And this is another area where we can be very hopeful, because a wave of economic research in the last 10, 15 years has documented rigorously the benefits of different modalities, so different ways of offering protection to the poorest people in our societies. And in some cases, the best designed interventions have results that are striking. This is just one simple example, is the evaluation published in Science of the ultra-poor graduation program pioneered by the NGO BRAC in Bangladesh. And as you can see, across 7 different countries, with the exception of Honduras, the model had striking results. In fact, Ethiopia is the country where the impacts of this approach were the largest in terms of being able to lift the consumption level of households that were the ultra-poor, the poorest of the poor, by very significant and large magnitudes. In Ethiopia, we are talking of, I cannot read it now, but I think from memory, it's around 20%. So these are very large meaningful gains that can really help people get out of poverty. And finally, on top of social protection, we're going to need developments in a third area, which is the area of mitigation. Here, perhaps we have less paradigmatic successful examples to showcase. But for example, conservation is a good example. So we certainly want to protect our forests, to afforest certain areas. But not all forests are equal. Not all biodiversity offers the same services. Losing a keystone species that offers very important services to a community is not equivalent to just having the drop of some population of some other species that is less central to the livelihoods of people. And so understanding how to do conservation in the way that is most cost effective and most beneficial for the existing communities, it's also paramount. Okay, so how am I doing with time? Left. Are done. Okay, good. So perfectly in time. So summarizing this thinking, basically this takes us to flag a few areas in the white paper where we think there are interesting research opportunities going forward. As I said, the first one is really is clean energy, because that's a game changer, what's going to make clean development possible. Social protection, as I've just stressed, is another really important paramount one, because climate change is going to hit developing countries, low-income countries, very hard. And so do some of these other environmental crises like air pollution or biodiversity crisis. And so we need to think of innovative ways of protecting people against the shocks. But also a set of core economic policies around firms, around labor markets, and around space that will generate in a sustainable way the development that these countries need. Okay, so that kind of takes me to the end of the first part of the presentation. That's broadly our thinking in the white paper. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes-ish is talk a little bit, just zoom in on one issue, which is climate change in Ethiopia. As I said, this is clearly selective. There are lots of other issues in Ethiopia right now. There is a poverty rate that has fallen very sharply, but is still stubbornly high. So there are macroeconomic imbalances and so on and so forth. So this is not to take away from all those other problems, but we hear about all those problems very often. And what I thought it would be useful to do to launch today's workshop is to zoom in a little bit about this changing climate. So these are forecasts. Well, unfortunately, you cannot fully see the, oh no, you can see the bottom of the slide. Perfect. So these are forecasts from the UN IPCC models. These are ensemble forecasts, so they come with a degree of uncertainty. So everything I'm going to say in this second section, please take with a pinch of salt, because obviously the moment we step away from just evaluating the impacts of something that has just been developed to forecasting the future, we are obviously dealing with things that are less precise. But the existing forecasts from the IPCC, basically the two key takeaways from those forecasts are, one, that Ethiopia is going to get hotter. So what you see in the top left and top right panels are temperature anomalies in degrees Celsius in different parts of the country in an earlier period, 2040 to 2059, and in a later period, 2080 to 2099. So almost towards the end of the century. And so you can see pretty much uniformly across the country with perhaps biggest increases in the center and north of the country, we'll just get a hotter Ethiopia. That's the first finding from these models. The second finding is that we're also going to get a wetter Ethiopia, although there are two big caveats here. But what the second, the bottom panels plot is the precipitation anomaly. So the change in precipitation between an earlier reference period in the 1980s and those two reference periods in the mid-century and end of century. And the colors are not fantastic, but basically where it gets light brown, that's when there is no anomaly. So dark brown is where you're losing some precipitation. Green means you're getting precipitation. And what you see is that in the middle of the century, we are going to get some drying, in particular in the north of the country. By the end of the century, on average, there is going to be more rainfall. Now, more rainfall, of course, can be in principle an opportunity, but there are two big caveats here. One is that not only you're going to get more on average, but the extremes are going to get worse. So you're going to get, for example, a lot of water in one go. Sorry, this is just another graph showing you the average amount of rainfall in different climate change scenarios, because we just don't quite know how effectively the world will mitigate climate change. Basically, there is a fair amount of agreement across the scenarios that the average amount of rainfall will increase. But the problem is that the variability of this rainfall is also going to increase, and the likelihood of extreme events is also going to increase. So on the one hand, you have an opportunity, more rainfall typically means more yields, is good for agriculture, but at the same time, this comes with these unwanted corollaries, which are higher variability. And so in the left panel here, you see that the risk of drought actually is going to go up significantly in Ethiopia and extreme heat. And also the risk of getting too much water in one go and hence flood is also going to go up, in this case, in the eastern part of the country. So basically, we're going to get a hotter Ethiopia, a wetter Ethiopia, which could be good news, except for the fact that it's also going to be less predictable and more prone to disaster events. What are the implications of this? Well, one implication that we are particularly interested in is related to migration. Because as you've seen in those maps, the impacts will be by no means uniform across the country. And some areas are going to be affected less. In fact, some areas, at least according to this forecast, almost unaffected. And some areas are going to be affected fairly badly. So you're going to have economic models project a big reshuffling of the population, depending on the different agroclimatic shocks that the different regions are going to experience. In particular, there will be movements out of some of the rain-fed croplands in the center and north of the country towards the cities. The sum of these, and of course there is a lot of uncertainty, both because it's hard to predict migration, but also because, as I said at the beginning, it's inherently hard to predict how the weather will change, is that we're going to have more migration overall, with some of the estimates telling us that we're going to have about 1.5 million climate migrants by 2050. Now, this is both a big figure and a small figure. It's a big figure because having 1.5 million extra migrants will be a policy challenge. You're going to need to, housing markets will have to respond, the school and health systems will have to respond, labor markets are going to be impacted in a major way by such a large flow of people. At the same time, this is in the context of a country where migration rates are not particularly high and where the shocks are going to be very heterogeneous. So perhaps you may even worry that 1.5 million migrants is too little, because you'd want more people to migrate out of areas of harm, areas that become less productive, less rich in amenities, towards areas that are productive and they're rich in amenities. Okay. So that's a brief overview of what we expect will happen in terms of Ethiopia's climate. So where does it leave us in terms of doing research? As I said, as Seneshaw was explaining, the IGC is a hub to promote research in low-income countries. We fund research, we do some research ourselves, we generate dissemination events, and so on. So we really want to be thinking hard now about zooming in on the situation of Ethiopia, on the case of Ethiopia. Where are the biggest opportunities? Where are the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities for doing research that is going to be impactful to face some of these challenges going forward? And I'm gonna, as I said, without any claim to being exhaustive, I'm just gonna pick 4 areas, which I think are instructive and may help kick off the discussion later today. The first one is social protection, so I'm gonna have a few things to say about that. Second one is firms and labor markets. That's an area where we produce a lot of research here at the IGC, and I will highlight some ideas for future research. The third one is, obviously, this is a key one if you start talking about climate change and the environment, it's agriculture and forestry. And finally, I'm going to mention energy. I'm obviously leaving a few things out. For example, we have a session on cities, so I'm going to leave cities to the session on cities and not talk about that here. And let me start talking about social protection, and doing that, just mentioning 2 research findings to kind of kick off the discussion. As you know, Ethiopia has a long history of trying to protect its people from the vagaries of the weather, from droughts, and other types of natural disasters. This used to be in the form of food and cash aid, and still is in the form of food and cash aid in many cases. But in the early 2000s, a fairly innovative program, the Productive Safety Net program, was launched with the idea of with the idea of developing on a model that was quite responsive to a model where assistance would be more predictable, would be more reliable, and in particular would be geared towards developing productive assets that would let people graduate out of a situation of vulnerability in the future. And so just to give you a number, here is a figure from a paper actually of Dr. Alemayehu here, a 2013 paper in economic development and cultural change that estimated the impact of the PSMP using a duration design. So they're comparing people who received 1 year of PSMP support to people who received 5 years of PSMP support. And the key finding of this paper is that moving from 1 to 5 years of PSMP support reduced the number of months that people spent in food insecurity by about 1.3. I'm sorry, I'll have to sit actually. Jet lag is hitting me, so I hope you don't mind if my physical performance is less good. Moving from 1 to 5 years of PSMP support will reduce the number of months that you spend in food insecurity by about 1.3, which is about 30% of the total time on average that households in the study area spent in food insecurity. So the key point here, the key takeaway from the study is that perhaps PSMP didn't solve the problem completely, but it's already making a big dent. The other thing that PSMP may do, and here I'm quoting recent evidence from a World Bank study, is actually decrease migration. And it's quite natural when you start thinking about it, because if you receive, migration is a coping mechanism against shocks. And so if you offer protection against shocks, you're going to decrease the incentive that people have to migrate out of these areas that are receiving the shocks. And so this recent World Bank study, for example, shows that this is comparing people living in neighboring Kebeles and neighboring Weredas. Some of them are eligible for PSMP and some of them not. So they're comparing comparable households across these borders. And what you see is that basically, well, you see two things. First of all, that migration rates are very low. Most households don't have a single migrant in the house. But the migration rates change significantly. In particular, they are halved. They are reduced by about 50% when households are offered the PSMP. Now, in a sense, that may be a good thing because it means that households are less distressed, so they are less in need to use this coping mechanism. But of course, it can also backfire if you are incentivizing the population to spend a longer time and invest more in areas that are becoming more and more prone to shocks. So these two findings, I cannot just pick them selectively to inspire a discussion here on social protection and climate change adaptation in Ethiopia. In particular, I think that there is 3 core questions that as IGC would be delighted to produce research on in the coming years. The first question is, we've seen the PSMP works, that it reduces food insecurity by about 1.3 months. But we don't quite yet have evidence of how PSMP copes at different level of climate shocks. Okay, so there was an average treatment effect. As shocks become more severe, we are interested to understand whether this program can still be protective when the shocks become really intense. And that evidence we don't have, and it's crucial evidence to have because otherwise we'll fail to know whether our existing social protection architecture needs to be supplemented when shocks pass a certain threshold. There is very, very, very early evidence on the ultra pro-graduation program in Bangladesh. I showed you the average effects just a couple of slides ago, showing that when areas are particularly shock-prone, floods in that case, in the case of Bangladesh, the program operates differently, and households, for example, invest less and save more in preparation for the shocks that are forthcoming, that are looming, and as a result of investing less, of course, at least the short-term effectiveness of the program is diminished. So first question is, what protection do existing programs offer against the most intense climate shocks? And here, in fact, the targeting issue will also be important. because as I've showed before, the geography of climate change may change in some important way the geography of the social protection needs that we currently have in the country. The second question is, and now this is related to the migration finding, is whether existing programs have features that actually discourage behaviors that would be good from the point of view of climate change adaptation, such as migration. Okay, in fact, in PSNP, one condition, which is perhaps not always implemented, but one condition for receiving support is actually not having a migrant in the household. Now, this is, I'm not a PSNP expert, so I don't know whether this has been changed in recent years, but it was true, at least up until recently. And so you can see how the program, for very good reasons, is trying not to target people who have a migrant because they have access to income from different parts of the country. They're presumably a bit better off. But this feature itself generates some of those negative migration effects that you've seen before that can actually be bad for climate change adaptation. So the second question that we want to ask is, are there features in existing programs that discourage adaptation unintendedly? And if so, how can we redesign, question 3, existing programs to promote adaptation rather than disincentivize it? Okay. So that's social protection. Let me quickly touch upon the other two areas, and then I'll close here. Second area is firms and labor markets. Ethiopia has probably, these are more well-known findings, has a stubborn problem of urban unemployment. It's between 15 and 20%. It's been like that since the 90s, late 90s, and it's confirmed by the latest labor force surveys. Unemployment is mechanically lower in rural areas because everybody gets to do a little bit of work in the family's farm, but it has been picking up in rural areas as well. And wages at the same time, while unemployment is high, have been fairly stagnant. There has been some real wage growth between, for example, 2013 and 2021, but it doesn't match the spectacular overall growth in GDP that we've seen in the country. So some of this money is not being translated in, some of that growth is not being translated in higher wages. At the same time, losing a job can be a major shock. So this is research that we're doing at the IGC right now that I'm directly involved with where we study what happened to some of the workers in Awassa that lost their jobs after mass layoff events that happened in 2022. And we can see that it's very hard for workers to find jobs, first of all, in the aftermath of the mass layoff event. The left panel shows you that the group that is called displaced control, the group that was displaced from their job, drops to almost zero employment just after the layoff event. And then a year after this layoff event, still hasn't really caught up with a comparable group that was not laid off. And as a result, and this was a group that prior to the layoff was consuming only 20% above the line of extreme poverty, you see a drop in consumption expenditure of about 10–15% that takes them right to the line of extreme poverty. So employment is high, wages have been growing, that's good, but perhaps not as fast as one would have hoped given the growth, and shocks can be a major threat to people in the labor market. So this takes me to a couple of questions that I want to throw to the audience. The first one is, well, the reason why wages have not been growing has to be at some level that worker productivity has not been growing fast enough. And so key question for us at the IGC is, how can we boost worker productivity growth? And here we should be broad in our thinking. Finance to firms, that's a problem that firms typically complain about. Electricity outages, another problem that firms typically complain about. The skill provision may be inadequate, in particular high-level skills such as ICT skills. There have been some important developments in the industrial parks and potentially in the future with economic zones, but evaluating how to do these things best will be things that we think are crucial at this stage. And secondly, as we are learning how not only how important jobs are, but also how bad it is for workers when they lose these jobs, we think we should be thinking more about protecting workers too against these shocks. We have the urban PSNP, and which is, however, really thought for people who are in extreme poverty, but preventing people who are aspiring middle class, like these women in the was industrial park that had escaped extreme poverty, but because of the shock are threatened to fall back into it, seems to be an area where further investigation would be worthwhile. Two quick slides to then end the discussion and leave the floor to continue. Agricultural forestry has to be there. As I said, the white paper, IGC's focus is really focused on innovation now. Agriculture is one area where innovation is going to be key. We need technologies, for example, seeds that are resilient to the kind of new shocks that countries like Ethiopia will face. And so this generates two important questions. One is, how do we develop the primary research in the first place? There are lots of crops. Research is very skewed towards crops that are grown in the West. There are lots of crops like sorghum or enset that could play an important role in food security in Ethiopia, for example. They receive a lot less research than some of their most Western consumed cousins. But also how we disseminate information about these new technologies, because we know that one thing is to develop the technology and the other one is to boost its uptake. And we'll have a presentation on radio information services later today. The other thing that I'm really keen on that we do some work on is afforestation and reforestation. So, of course, we know through the Green Legacy Initiative that the government has really invested heavily in these programs, and we'll be keen to support this effort, understand where it has performed best, why, how to make the program sustainable. The program relies a lot on volunteers. How do we get the private sector involved through public-private partnership models? Final slide, and then I'll close. Energy. This is a big area. It's a bit outside of my expertise, but I'll give you a few pointers of the things that we're thinking about at the IGC in terms of core questions that we'd like to see more research on. The first one is extending the use of electricity and reducing in a contemporaneous way the use of biomass. In a sense, Ethiopia is very much ahead because electricity is very clean. A lot of it is hydropower. So that's fantastic. The problem is simply that a lot of energy is not in the form of electricity. It's through burning biofuels that generates indoor pollution and lots of other issues. So extending electricity usage, we are very keen to do research here. On the supply side, one thing that I'll flag is that although there have been this great investment in hydropower that really forms the backbone of the electricity supply landscape in Ethiopia, we see interest in doing research on solar too, as a technology that can complement the development of hydro. And finally, if we want to develop, extend access, but also get into these new development technologies, we'll need to think about developing markets for electricity and addressing the endemic issue of electricity theft and poor pricing. Okay, so that's enough from me, but just to conclude, the IGC is really keen to promote research on sustainable growth in Ethiopia and sustainable development in Ethiopia. We want to build on some of our initial strengths, like, for example, the work on labor markets and firms, but also branch into new areas. It seems that Ethiopia does face several sustainable growth challenges, opportunities too. And we really hope that today's workshop will be a watershed moment, at least in our trajectory as an institute here, to generate new thinking and new ideas for launching a new wave of research on sustainable growth in Ethiopia. That's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I first would like to thank the IGC for the invitation. I also would like to thank Stefano for an excellent presentation. I'll start by noting that this is a timely paper and presentation, given the need for and the demands of sustainable development in places like Ethiopia. So as we have heard, and as we can see from a quick look at the paper, underlying paper, it's outlined, the focus is to outline the nature of sustainable development and the demands of the consequences and demands of climate change and economic growth. So it's the aim of balancing these two. It also defines, as we have heard, a research agenda that is relevant to Ethiopia. It is important to mention at this juncture that I came into the scene rather late, so I cannot do justice to the depth and spread of the paper as well as the presentation, given the time that I have to review them. So I ask you to keep that in mind when you consider my comments and queries. The comments are, as usual, intended to contribute to further discussions, conversation. So the first thing I'd like to do is to locate these specific questions, priorities, and instruments that Stefano's presentation outlined, and also the paper that is produced by IGC, the white paper that is produced by IGC, and a broader challenge for Ethiopia as well as other poor countries. I think the core challenge is how to bring about sustainable development. One of the elements of that is to look at the question, why do some countries succeed and others fail? And this in obviously both sectoral and national economic transformation or sustainable development. And this is, as you know, important because some of the successful countries achieved success despite what we may consider unfavorable initial conditions, whether it is their history, their geography, or their institutions. So what are the core mechanisms that allow these successful countries to achieve what they achieve? And a footnote here is that where one starts is not destiny, it is where one starts. And that's an important premise. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, initial conditions, one of the lessons from successful countries' achievements is that initial conditions are not destiny. So we have to recognize that fact. So the related question obviously is, how can Ethiopia learn from its own experience as well as the experience of successful countries? These are the two broader challenges that we should look at the exercise, the effort that IGC contributed. And in this regard, there is one key ingredient that we usually do not start from, but in economics and economic development economics, there is an increasing realization of that, and outputs are being produced to that effect. And that is, how does such development actually happen? How does development happen actually? And this is different from how economists perceive development is or should be. Okay. So there are products here or research here Stefan Derkon's Gambling on Development is one, and Yuan Ang, how China break out of the poverty trap is another. Actually, describing and understanding how development actually occurs. And here a related question is then how can existing local capacities, demands, and institutions can be used to trigger positive feedback, a positive feedback loop and co-evolution. And this is an important point. I always mention that in recent years, and that is we have to use what we have, not what we should have, or we may have, or we can have. Because a lot of our prescriptions talk about first-best solutions. Even when we talk about failures, market failures or government failures, our solutions are not necessarily locally motivated. They are broad principles that may or may not apply. So this question is an important element. Now the paper and the presentation contributes to specifically exploring sequences and prioritization questions. And they identify 6 areas of priorities, both for research and development policy. They also identify and assess instruments such as public investment, taxation, regulation, standards, procurement policies, and so on. They also raise the question of scalability, again, an important area of research and development policy. One area that perhaps the further emphasized in subsequent conversation and research is cost. The question of cost appears in 2 ways as far as I can see in this context. The first is the costs of the interventions or the instruments. They are generally high. And obviously one argues that, of course, although the costs are high, the returns are higher. So these investments are, or these interventions are viable and sensible. But that is true, including, for instance, graduation programs in social protection. The challenge is there are short-term constraints which simply do not allow investing in these high return activities. So how can we improve these short-term resource constraints? A variety of ways of creative instruments and activities. So that is one important area of cost that we have to look at in research as well as policy design. The second dimension of cost is intergenerational. Generally, these interventions may bring about some returns immediately, but generally the returns are longer term, particularly when we talk about climate change and sustainable development. And the costs are incurred by the current generation, if you like. So there is this intergenerational tension, which has to be explored further, and instruments of addressing it should be developed. There is some effort in that respect. It is not sufficient to say that this is Pareto optimal, because that is a potential. It is not necessarily actual. So it is important to look into those. A small point about migration. There is a paper by John Hardenoten about the same question, the impact of PSNP on migration and family size. So there is delayed marriage of adolescent girls. So although that increases family size, it means it reduces migration. So that mechanism should also be looked into. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think for the interest of time, we had a very good presentation by Professor Stefano and also reflection by Professor Alemayehu. As the program detects, we go to Q&A. So we should take some questions from the audience and give few minutes to the presenters, to reflect. I think we have about 45 minutes, so let you have the opportunity to speak. One, two. Let me give an opportunity first for 5 people, please, so that I can save time. 1, 2 at the back, 3. 4th opportunity. So let's start with this, please.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Nemera. And thanks a lot for the IGC for having us today. A great presentation by Stefano and reaction by Alex as well. So mine is a bit of a comment, a question. You can take it the way you feel is appropriate. I've looked at the list of research questions that Stefano has listed out. I have a couple of more additions that I would like to make, but whether they make the cut to IGC's priority is something that really depends on, how IGC thinks about these issues. The one is, as highlighted in the presentation, what we observe in many instances is whenever there is a drastic climate change, there is going to be migration. And we have already seen it in Ethiopia in terms of, some of the IDPs being mobility being induced by drought and corresponding severe weather shocks. Now, what would also arise is when people move, there is a probability that conflict might arise because there would be competition for resources. When pastoral communities move to agricultural land, people in sedentary settings are not going to sit idle and see when their land is occupied by newcomers, and those people are really moving because of the severe conditions in their existing areas. So I would imagine if we're thinking about climate change, issues of conflict and how to handle them or prevent them would also be something of a priority, at least both from the research and from policy side as well. So what can we do to make sure that conflicts don't arise, or when they arise, what can we do to minimize their impacts as well? There is this fascinating study by Nathan Nunn, forthcoming on Review of Economic Studies, and he talks about, they talk about, I think it's a co-authored paper, how conflict change or significant variations in rainfall induce conflict between communities that are mostly pastoral and communities that are agricultural, and this tends to be intensified during dry seasons compared to wet seasons. So as you have more dry seasons, this seems to be almost inevitable, and it's really useful to talk about this, not just from the perspective of knowledge generation, but also from the design of development projects that can potentially prevent these conflicts from intensifying. My second comment, coming from the African Gender Innovation Lab, I am almost compelled to speak about the gender aspect. We know that, climate change is not going to have a symmetrical or uniform impact in communities. Women are more likely to be affected more than men for a host of reasons. For example, you can't think about water fetching or firewood fetching, which becomes more difficult, which increases the duration they need to do this, or the time that they need to spend doing this throughout the day. This is a time that could have been used either for childcare, for labor market activities, or for education for young adolescents, women. So climate change, its effect, while it could be pervasive, it could be more intensified in some communities. And these are the 3 things that I mentioned, in terms of intensifying time poverty, in terms of reducing labor market participation, as well as probably reducing, educational enrollment and outcome would have significant welfare implications, which could also be intergenerational. So it would be useful to think about, to what extent, this disproportional effect of climate change can also be captured in some of these, research questions. Thank you.
Thank you, IGC, for the invitation and for preparing this conference. And also, I thank Professor Stefano. My name is Hala from Yigzao. I am from Policy Studies Institute. I have like two questions. One is related to unemployment, and another is related to the graduation approach. So my first question is like developing countries like Ethiopia, they face a critical challenge, particularly related to unemployment. There is huge unemployment rate in Ethiopia, and there are like several interventions have been implemented in order to reduce like this unemployment rate, particularly related to youth unemployment. And yeah, there are like many papers by you, Professor Stefano, and also Groom. My first question is like, do you think that like the existing interventions are like they contribute to the sustainable development in the country? Because just many people argue that, I mean, some people argue that there are no like unfilled employment opportunities in countries like Ethiopia. So if this underlying assumption is true, then it means that the existing interventions are not really contributing like to decreasing the overall rate of unemployment, but it's like creating a negative externality, and it's like providing creating jobs to some people by just taking away some of the opportunities from the other people. Like I have read just many of your papers, including the AR paper and also the review of economic studies paper. They providing like the job, I mean the transport subsidy, and also the workshop, and also the job application incentives. So do you think that this kind of interventions contribute like to the sustainable development goal in general? Because just the main argument is that there in countries like Ethiopia there are no or very limited unfilled employment employment opportunities. And I am also interested to know like about the general equilibrium effects of this kind of interventions. Do you think that just when you look at the general equilibrium effects of this kind of interventions, just what's the overall effect of this kind of interventions? And my second question is related to the graduation approach. I am currently involved in a graduation intervention in northern Kenya, where we provide several interventions like for poor communities who are exposed to climate shocks. And this kind of approach, they involve a huge amount of resources, including training, seed money, and a lot of resources. So do you think that this kind of approach are feasible, sustainable, and also scalable? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the presenter and also the discussant. I have about 3 or so questions quickly, focusing on the white paper. Maybe I could start with this distinction between sustainable growth and sustainable development. In the presentation, I see reference made to sustainable development. although perhaps the paper seems to be focusing on sustainable growth. I am wondering whether these are being used interchangeably, given the fact that we know this difference between growth and development. The paper also seems to focus on climate change issues, but my understanding is that it deals with environmental issues broadly. I think I haven't read the paper carefully, but it refers to a number of environmental issues more broadly. So I was wondering whether the focus is just on climate change or general environmental issues, including things like ecosystems, biodiversity, and so on. I think the paper seems to be focusing on low and middle income countries. That's my understanding from reading of at least the introduction. And that is probably why you are focusing on perhaps innovation as a critical issue, which is important for all countries, I would say. But my question there is, what do you think is the role of population as an issue as well, talking about sustainability, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa, which is likely to be an important problem for the coming decades? The last question is looking at the conclusions in the paper, unless I have missed it, I haven't seen a reference made to the importance of fund for adaptation. It refers to loss and damage as well as mitigation funds. So I was wondering if that is true, why? Thank you.
Second round of opportunity. One. We have about 15, 20 minutes to receive your questions, so please feel free to take the opportunity. Second, please, here. Yes. Let's continue, please.
So thank you very much for the nice presentation. Like the issue is, it is revolving around the technology and this climate change and the role of the government in providing social protection and other interventions. But as we know, the issue of the budget in the government, the issue of the budget is critical, and the issue of the capacity of the government as well as efficiency. Like most of the case, government is inefficient. And therefore, this requires, this issue of the technology innovation, the climate change intervention requires a big resource. And in that sense, where is the role of the private sector? I think that the role of the private sector is very important, like in terms of research and development, in terms of social protection, in terms of other issue. And therefore, I think in the paper, like it overlooks the role of the private sector because focusing only on the government, probably, like as I said, the issue of the resources is very important. So how do you encourage the role of the private sector and capacitating them, inviting them to involve in this climate change issue? I think the role of private sector must be focused on. Thank you.
I also thank the presenter and the discussant. I am a little bit curious about the impact and the linkage of industry with the agriculture sector, cities, agriculture, and jobs. The role of industrial parks and economic zones have been mentioned, but manufacturing, particularly industries, have a significant impact on the climate. And incentive issues have been raised also in terms of cost as well. So far as I understand, particularly the incentive schemes we adapted are not mainly focused on performance and results. In this case, effectiveness, in terms of also cost, and the impact they will have, particularly with consideration of the recent industrial policy that has been adopted. It is, I think, very important to link climate issues and the incentives with the industrial policy. So I would like your reflection on this area. Thank you.
Another round of opportunity. So if no, I'll give the chance to Professor Stefano and also Professor Alemayehu to respond to the issues raised. First, Professor Stefano, please.
This is okay. Okay, this was a fantastic set of questions. To answer them in with enough to do them justice, we will need probably one workshop per question. So let me be a bit briefer than the one workshop per question. Conflict, Girum, it's a very well-established finding that unfortunately increases in temperature and disasters do lead to conflict. As you were laying out your thinking about this, I thought I should mention Nathan Nann's recent paper in West Africa, and then it turns out that was part of the reason that where this question was coming from. Is certainly a big issue. I would say maybe linking this to Alemayehu's point of picking on successful examples in different countries. I suspect, I'm not an expert, but again, this is certainly an area that makes the IGC research threshold. But I suspect that there is a clear interaction between the conflict over resources that is initiated by climate shocks and the background availability of arms. So countries like, for example, Colombia have made great strides in reducing conflict by having these systematic capillary, very intensive demobilization campaigns. And I guess Ethiopia may need to think about doing that going forward, because it is obviously an issue related to just the wide availability of arms and the just fuels instability. So you're kind of have this kind of background situation that then can catch fire very easily. So that's one thing, demobilization. The other one would be social protection, because some of that distress migration to areas where you will not be welcomed will not happen, or can happen in a more orderly way if you have social protection that prevents you from moving. When I was working for the Ministry of Agriculture in Addis Ababa 15 years ago, a thing that used to be best practice was destocking. So the idea the pastoralist, if a shock could be forecasted in advance, would be invited to sell some of their cattle at good prices. They would be slaughtered and sold at international markets. And then they would have the cash to withstand the crisis and build some stock after the end of the drought, for example. If you instead wait for your cattle or goats to become emaciated and sick and maybe die, their market value is negligible. You lose your assets, you don't have anything. So kind of smart social protection and demobilization hopefully can make great strides. Gender certainly makes the cut again also. It's surprisingly under-researched, actually. There are a few papers in India that document the gendered impact of droughts on, for example, the allocation of labor and so on. Very little on Sub-Saharan Africa. I'd love to see more. Things may backfire a little bit. For example, there is a known correlation that female labor force participation tend to be lowest among recent migrants to cities. So to the extent that what climate change will do is push a lot of people from areas in the countryside to cities that may actually be initially if you help them move to cities because that's good in terms of being protected from climate, it can backfire from a gender perspective because the men can find jobs and the women cannot. And so, whereas before they had some economic activities inside the household that gave them some bargaining power, that becomes eroded quite quickly if you don't work. So there can be kind of perverse gender effects to some of these interventions that we should definitely be studying. Then there was a fantastic question that was very specific on some of our papers, Girum, I guess the question had two parts. In fact, the question was really about the general equilibrium effects of labor market interventions, or in particular, interventions designed to help people find jobs. And the concern was, well, if there is a fixed pool of jobs available, there are 10 jobs, and you help some people to get some of these 10 jobs, you can maybe design a very smart intervention that helps them find these jobs, but these jobs would have been taken by somebody else in the economy. So the total number of employed people doesn't change. You just reshuffled who is employed. And I should flag, there is, I don't know whether people here follow VoxDev. It's also partly funded by the IGC, but it's mostly funded by CEPR. It's a web portal that publishes research and development economics. And I'm currently, I've just co-authored the literature review on this type of policies that will be live on VoxDev next month. So it will be a virtual launch session. So stay, if you're particularly interested in this field, we reviewed that literature quite extensively, and there'll be a literature review coming out. Key point is, we don't know about general equilibrium effects. In a very static world, what you say is exactly true. So these interventions will not change the level of employment. You can only use them for equity reasons. If you think there is a group that needs, like youth, for example, a step up the ladder because they're struggling, or women, or displaced people, or whatever. So they only have an equity rationale. It is, however, true that the more we're doing research on firms, the more we realize the firm dynamism is key to development. And so in a view of the world where firms actually are deciding whether to grow or not, depending, for example, on the state of the labor market, depending on how easy it is for them to find talent, you can get general equilibrium effects, positive ones, from these interventions because of increasing the ease of finding talent. Perhaps my favorite macro finding, as you've seen from my presentation, I'm a fairly micro-minded person, but sometimes read macro too. There are very interesting things, but my favorite macro finding is in a recent paper by Kevin Donovan at Yale and co-authors, which is in the QJ, and is a paper that shows that the poorer a country is on average, the more likely it is that a given job terminates. So the likelihood of a job being destroyed, either because of the worker quitting or because of the employer firing, like in the Awassa example that I showed before, is higher and higher the poorer a country gets. These findings suggest that these labor markets are not working very well because they're matching people that actually don't want to, they're matching workers and firms that actually are not a great match, because the match gets destroyed very quickly, either by the worker or by the firm. So that is not smoking gun evidence yet, but it's suggestive evidence that there are problems with the allocation of talent in these labor markets, and hence that if we fix them, we can improve firm dynamism and hence move from 10 jobs to, I don't know, 13 jobs. And so then you've also created jobs and not just reshuffled them. I don't want to speak forever. A graduation program, is that too expensive? It is expensive. There are lots of components. The jury is out on exactly what is the minimum viable package. There was a recent trial in Ghana that tried to unpack it a little bit, and unfortunately, some of the bits alone don't quite do it. If you're just given a goat and you've never raised the goat and you don't get any training, the goat dies. And so the program, and then you wasted your resources. But I can imagine that with more research, we'll be able to have a slightly leaner, more scalable package. Then I had several questions on the white paper. Very subtle questions. For example, the use of the word growth in the paper and the use of the word development in my presentation. You can see that maybe I have a slight preference for using the word development that I find broader, and I was a majority in the team of co-authors. So the word growth prevailed. So there was a very subtle thing to pick up, but in general, I think there is agreement on the substance here. So we want growth, not per se. We want growth because of the transformational impact that it can have on humans. That's why I like the word development better than growth, because it's clearer on the objective. And that's why it's so self-defeating, that growth can then undermine human welfare. For example, if you just pollute your cities and everybody and take away years of life through cancer and heart disease and all the diseases that come from pollution. The climate change is the most studied and the most salient problem now because of the big interest in the international community. That's what a lot of funding is. Certainly, we see biodiversity as a challenge. The most read article on VoxDev, the web portal that I mentioned just before, I'm an editor of VoxDev, actually. The most read article on VoxDev this year is an article by Anand Sudarshan on the collapse of vultures in India. You may think, who cares about vultures? That's maybe if you're in the Andes and there is this famous fly of the condor, it has some tourist value. It doesn't have much economic value. It turns out that the scavengers have a huge economic value because they clean the countryside. So they provide basically waste disposal services. And the paper identifies very cleanly that the collapse of vulture population in India due to the introduction of a pesticide that turned out to be very bad for vultures too, led to an increase in mortality from waterborne diseases comparable to the increase in mortality that we expect from extreme heat from climate change in India. So collapse of vulture, same mortality impact as climate change. So it can be huge, but not all species, as I said before, are equally central to ecosystem services and to people's livelihoods. So we need to understand where to focus our efforts. Perhaps I'll kind of end on one last point. Different people mentioned the private sector in different ways. This is certainly an area of focus for us. So we certainly welcome more private sector development and would like to do more research on private sector dynamism. It's crucial. It seems that the industrial parks were very successful in many ways. Perhaps they were not as successful in generating linkages to the surrounding economy. So for example, that's one lead for more research on how to strengthen those linkages. I've spoken for too long. I'll stop here. And perhaps Alemayehu wants to say a few words.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say a few words on two questions. One related to the graduation approach and the challenge of scaling up. So the evidence, most of the evidence that these programs work reflects relatively small interventions, programs designed and managed by NGOs, not all of them, but most of them. And there is one, for instance, large intervention in India, which is extensively studied by some of the IGC lead academics. And the point that, or the question that arise from these evidence, therefore, is that it is good as far as it goes, but we should work on more analysis to see how large government implemented programs of this kind fare. Would they succeed? Would they, how costly they would be? All sorts of questions are relevant and open to the social protection agenda Stefano outlined. A related question, which is kind of usually not considered because we focus on the beneficiaries of these programs and their graduation out of poverty, is that what happens in the community? So what would be, how can these programs effectively contribute to the transformation of productive capacities in the communities they are implemented, such that the benefits go beyond beneficiaries, in addition to general equilibrium effects. The general equilibrium effects in any case will happen, but I'm thinking in terms of a more active design of such programs such that they would contribute significantly to enhancing productive capacity in their communities through public works, better design public works, and other considerations. So that's one. The second point is about labor markets, but more broadly institutions, including markets in poor economies like Ethiopia. We generally are very good and clever at identifying their weaknesses. So market failures of one kind or another prevail. We are very good at identifying them and proposing solutions for that. What we generally ignore are the good qualities of those institutions, because these institutions have strengths. And ultimately, what happens, or how development happens, is building on those strengths. It's not always necessarily creating new institutions. It is by enhancing. The more common avenue is enhancing existing institutions and then creating these virtuous cycles. So we should be more active and keen on looking at the strengths or good qualities of existing institutions in poor countries, as much as we focus on their weakness. Thank you.
Yes. I'm so generous. I was about to conclude, but I'll give you a chance.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, IGC for inviting me. It is a big privilege to see former professors, colleagues, and also my former students. So that is just a backdrop to a very brief comment that I would like to make. I think when you showed firms and labor markets, you focused on those who are already in employment. Maybe I think I should say that I should admit that I didn't read the white paper, but the focus there is on those who are already in employment. Do you have anything to say on those who are out of the labor force? That is one. The second one is more fundamental and not necessarily fashionable, but given the structure of African economies, we have a large informality or informal sector. And I was surprised that in your new research agenda, you don't have informality. Maybe another surprise is that you highlighted how technology can be a driver of sustainable development. Yesterday in African Union with Theodros, we were leading a panel on artificial intelligence and technology and how it can be leveraged for economic development. Therefore, my question is, do you consider technology as part of your new research agenda? Because it is going to really dramatically reshape the workforce as well as what we see in economic development for Africa, even if we are a little bit behind in the AI race. So these are the brief comments that I have. Otherwise, a huge privilege to be here.
Thank you so much for this last set of comments and questions. A few reflections starting from technology. So, and innovation more broadly. We like to use the word innovation where technological innovation is one of them, but we think of innovation as being also institutional innovation or policy innovation. Certainly we are, so I didn't, as I said before, I just picked a few things that I thought would spark discussion. I didn't meant that there was an exhaustive list. One area where technology will make an immediate big impact will be in the area of seed development and the diffusion of shock resistant seeds. But you are right, there are lots of other areas where technology will be key. AI, of course, it's a double-edged sword. It will generate opportunities. You need to be to have a certain level of skills in the workforce to adopt some of these new systems. In other economies, it tends to eat away at the middle of the wage distribution, which is a very unwelcome development, because then you're left with jobs that are just too little productivity for anybody to be for them to be worth automating. And then you have really high creativity, high skill jobs, and then the kind of middle of the distribution gets eaten away by jobs by AI. So then ChatGPT is gonna write your invitation letter for the workshop. So nobody has to write invitation letters anymore. At some point they'll come for us too, maybe, but yeah. So inequality will be a key challenge in my mind when those tools get scaled up. There is the question of whether the focus on manufacturing will become obsolete once 3D printing and so on will really take off. I think it's kind of premature, so we don't see any signs of that happening quite yet. But yes, certainly, if there was a good research proposal on some of these topics, we would be very happy to consider funding it. And your first point was on, I forgot in fact. Oh, informality, sorry, informality. Informality, of course. So that's a huge issue. I mean, informality, the only thing I'd say is perhaps I try to focus on things that were not yet highly studied, and informality, it's a central issue, but it's an issue that has received a lot of attention. So that's why I didn't put it up there. Original work on informality, of course, we would be happy to study it. There is interesting developments in the literature. So there used to be this kind of very stark sense that either you were completely informal and outside of the formal economy altogether, or you were a formal firm. And at least in some countries like Brazil, there is a decent amount of informality in formal firms. And in general, the boundaries between the two sectors, my understanding of the latest research suggests that they're a lot more porous than we used to think. To the extent that, for example, I'll just mention one research finding and close it here. There is a very nice paper by Gabriele Ulissea, UCL, and Clément Imbert, Sciences Po, who study what happened in Brazil when you had this big migration influx after climate shocks and the like in some of the dry areas in the north of Brazil in particular. Contrary to the standard prediction of Harry Stodaro, what happened was that you had this big influx of informal workers. And in fact, a few years later, fast forward a few years later, formal employment went up. The Harry Stodaro model would tell you, no, the pool of formal workers is kind of fixed. These people will join the queue of unemployed and will just wait for their turn to get one of these formal jobs. And instead, there was dynamism. Wages dropped, and the number of formal jobs went up. So very contrary to the kind of standard Harry Stodaro's prediction. The catch is firm dynamism, which was not part of Harry Stodaro. And it goes back to my response also to the gentleman there on the general equilibrium effects. The catch is that once you have, once the pool of available workers changes, firms change their investment strategies too. And in Brazil in particular, they decided to go for a more labor-intensive, high-scale mode of production. So because there were more workers, they could hire them for a little cheaper. So they actually increase formality rather than decrease formality in that. So there are a few things in that space that are new, but in general, it's a very highly studied topic. So that's why I didn't make the list, but I agree with you that it's super important. Alemayehu, I don't know whether you have any closing thought, Dr.
Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes, and I would like to reflect on two main issues before we conclude. And I'm sure the next session that we are going to discuss also relate to these broader, white paper issues that we've raised in the white paper. I think we have a session in the afternoon where we are going to discuss where are we going, from here, in terms of, how should we commission these research, areas, and how can we make sure that, the government uses for a reform, also for a policy making. I think the afternoon session will be really important. Some of the issues that you have raised in the social protection, for example, how are we going to make sure that the Ethiopia's social protection mechanisms are so targeted? The graduation approach is also one thing, and also how we design those interventions, the social works and other activities, and also in the agriculture, climate smart methods such as irrigation-based, agriculture, and also adopting certain technologies such as, you've mentioned earlier about climate shocks resilient, varieties. And these are really, an important issues that the government is, making so exercises through its reform process and planning exercise. I think the after session would be really interesting. And I also see some, researchers from different government institutes here, and we should, discuss further on that. How are we going to Commission and strengthen the partnership. I think one final point I wanted to make here is, which I haven't, raised in the white paper, is about the global trends. Especially when we talk about, social protections, there are huge challenges domestically, of course, some issues raised in the white paper, and one of the colleagues also raised earlier. The government has a limited capacity in terms of, resource mobilizations, and also the economy itself. The domestic, saving mobilizations is very limited for the domestic, private sectors. So on most of the cases, be it social protection, which are going to be largely through borrowing, and also adopting technologies, which are going to be through foreign direct investment. But when you look at the global trends, be it the West and the East, issues are more becoming inward looking, to which, the prospect looks that the flows of capital technologies to developing economies is over the time being limited. And talking about such, grants, and we should also bring in the international global trends, structures. The incentive mechanisms are really important. And I think, such a very micro level discussions are really important. And also, as Professor Seyoum mentioned earlier about the initial situation as in the context of countries, and also the national macroeconomic frameworks challenges they are facing in relation to also the global trends are really important. Then we need to put in context. For example, you talk about the solar technologies. Yes, Chinese are advancing a lot in terms of bringing low cost, technologies in solar energies. But what Chinese economy is facing now and what it looks over the next 10, 15, 20 years, and the prospect for low-income economics in terms of, climate change commitments, and also mobilizing resources for adaptation is really fundamental. And we need to put, things in context so that we will, I think the paper would benefit from that, and also elevate the policy, attentions and nuances in that regard. Otherwise, I think we had a very interesting discussions. As I said earlier in the afternoon session, we have a discussion where we're going to discuss, where should we take, from here, sort of, discussions, and what's the role of government, and also our partners in that regard. So I think we should stop there, go for a coffee break, 30 minutes, and I will get back to the technical sessions. Thank you very much.